I'm going to show you a battle between two world champions. Magnus Carlsen, who's the classical and rapid world champion at the moment, and Wesley So, who is the Fischer Random world champion, and they were playing Fischer Random Chess in the Champion Showdown organised by the St. Louis Chess Club. This is a really interesting strategic game. So Carlsen with the white pieces. Let's just have a look at the baseline before we kick off. You can see these two bishops here. Now, they're going to be fighting to get into the game, but it's going to be interesting to see, how these pawns are arranged to get those bishops working. That's one thing. And then the king is going to have to decide, where's it going to go? Is it going to stay in the center? Probably not. Or which side of the board is it going to end up on? Okay, on with the game. Pawn to g3 from Carlsen. That seems to be a priority in Fischer Random, to make sure that your bishops actually come into play quickly. Knight c6. Okay, bring your knight out. Fine. That's taking a different approach. c4 from Carlsen, so that pawn is backed by the rook. Pawn to f5, so one of those bishops is cut loose on this diagonal, opens up. Pawn to d3, and now g6. So that pawn move potentially allows that knight in, but apart from that doesn't achieve a huge amount. But g6 played by So, and that means that both bishops are now flying across the board, so that looks attractive. Knight c3, knight comes into the game, and e5. Now if we just look at the pawn structure, this looks like a typical English position, English opening that is, or a reversed Sicilian. But this one looks like it could be favourable for black, because at the moment this side of the board doesn't have a huge amount of protection. We need one of those bishops to here to match black's bishops over there, and black already has potential to open the position with e4 to destabilize that pawn on c4. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what is the king doing? That king looks like in a really odd position. If black could get this knight in and then e4 and undermine the pawn on c4. So Carlsen already has a slight problem here. So how do you deal with that? Well, you could block that e-pawn. Again, looks like a typical kind of English opening move, but actually after f4, that kind of leaves that bishop not very well placed, and this is a nice space advantage. Carlsen took quite a radical decision here. He took on c6. So Wesley recaptured, and then pawn to e4 from Carlsen. So what he's doing is he's got rid of that light squared bishop. So even if the position closes, then it's not going to be blocked in. So in some senses that makes some kind of sense, but the problem is that actually, because Carlsen has given up that light squared bishop, then his pawn structure is actually very inflexible. It's going to make it very difficult to open the position, because these will fly, those bishops over there. Okay, let's see how things worked in practice. Well, both sides now castled on the queen side. Let's just see that. So there we go. Castle's queen side. And now that rook is looking at the king. So Carlsen also castled. So that rook at least protects that pawn. So backward pawn, can't put immediate pressure on it, but still it's not great having a backward pawn there. And one of Carlsen's problems is that these knights don't have very good squares to turn to. Let me just get rid of that window. Okay. So let's see how things work. So knight b6. So potentially puts a little bit more pressure here. So maybe you can take here, and certainly white can't recapture with the d pawn. So Wesley bringing the knight into the game looks good. Carlsen plays f3 to support the pawn on e4. But you can see how white's pawns are quite inflexible. You know, you wouldn't really want to make any of these advances because they would, well, either lose something or give these bishops the opportunity to fly across the board. Now, Wesley plays knight d7. Good move. So this knight wasn't doing much on b6, but you never know. It might come into c5, and then it looks here. It might bounce back there. Looks good. Knight b3. Carlsen brings the knight into play. b6, good move from Wesley. So makes this bishop look not great, just hitting against that pawn, which is solidly protected. Also gives the king a nice square on a light square. There's no light square bishop, so that king can happily sit on b7. Now, Carlsen brought the bishop into play via e3. Well, I'm not sure about that move, but I would say this is already a difficult position for white. So, for example, if king b1, then black can just take his time here because white really can't do much. I mean, one possibility to create a square for one of the knights in the center is to exchange on f5 and then play g4. So if this pawn is exchanged, then you can see that knight would gain the nice e4 square. The problem is then black has this nice move, e4. And look at those bishops fly across the board. So for example, like this. Okay, let's just damage that king position. Now you can see, having got rid of that d pawn, well, these pawns are desperately weak. White's king looks really weak. So that's typical of what can happen if white tries to break open the position. These bishops will fly, and they're flying in the direction of white's king. This is Carlsen's problem. He doesn't have a really active plan here. Now he played bishop e3. Wesley played f4. Good move. Bishop d2 played. If g takes f4, then you can see this just opens up this diagonal again, but also gives that knight a beautiful square on e5. I mean, this is just better for black. So Carlsen put the bishop back on d2 and g5. So Wesley has just this really nice space advantage on the king side. And king side. Okay, that gets really confusing. On this side of the board. King side and queen side don't really exist in Fischer Random, do they? No. Okay, it's funny. We have to change our phrasing here. So, I mean, later on, this could be really useful to get some kind of breakthrough for black. And it just really cramps white on this side of the board. Knight e2, and you can see that these, all of white's minor pieces here are struggling for good squares, particularly the knights. So Carlsen has a plan to put the bishop on c3, but the knights, they're not going anywhere at all. Bishop f6 played by Wesley. Bishop c3, so this is Carlsen's idea to put this bishop on a decent square, it's true, and it does to some extent protect the king. But now Wesley goes on the attack. He starts to take the initiative. Pawn to a5. So potentially with the idea to push that knight out of the way. And then to play knight c5. King b1 makes room. King b7. There's no rush. Very nice. Potentially allowing the rook to a8. Very nice. a3, okay, he's trying to cover some squares. I like the idea of pushing that knight straight away, actually, and playing bishop e6, and starting perhaps some kind of offensive on this side of the board, and potentially later on here, or queen f7 as well, and then knight c5. But anyway, that's another way to play. I didn't quite understand why Wesley was playing rook e7 here. Queen f2. Okay, Carlsen looking at these squares, but really it's suggesting a lack of a plan again. a4, pushing the knight back. And now Wesley played rook e6. Again, looks slightly odd because it blocks this bishop, but I think the rooks should be together on the back rank. But anyway, black still has the advantage here. It's a nice position. And now this is typical of Carlsen. He hates passive positions. And here, he wants to strike out. He wants to break out. I suppose if he'd done nothing, well, there are moves, again, like perhaps moving the queen and then knight here, or perhaps rook here. Got to watch out for that. But black can build up at his leisure here. So Carlsen broke open. He exchanged here and then played d4. He doesn't like to hang around. But this creates a terrible weakness on c4. That pawn cannot be protected by b3. That's one of the advantages of advancing that a pawn. Let's see how it worked. So takes on d4, bishop d4, and now rook d6. Having opened the position, of course, now the rook is perfectly placed. For black, that is. Bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop. Rook takes rook. And pawn takes rook. Knight c3. So you can see that pawn could be taken straight away, but that pawn could be taken. So rook a8 protects that pawn and leaves this one still very weak. Queen c2. So now two pieces attacking that pawn. Knight e5. What a beautiful square for the knight. Looking at c4, looking at f3. Really nice. Knight takes a4. Now Wesley went for knight takes c4. It's the best one to go for because basically that knight is now right in the face of white's king, and in combination actually with all black's pieces, it's looking, well, I was going to say unpleasant for white. It's a lost position. Carlsen really doesn't have a defense here. He played rook g1, bringing the rook to the open file. Okay, watch out for potentially a rook takes bishop, and then queen takes knight, no problem. Queen d4 protects the knight, hits the rook, moves the queen into the zone. We like that. Also, Carlsen eye over here. Rook d1 hits the queen away. That's necessary. Which came back to a better square than f6, queen e5, and the rook came back again. Well, at this moment, Carlsen would be desperate for a draw. But of course, Wesley is having none of it. Bishop f7. Very calm, just getting the bishop out of the line of the rook, so this knight is still solidly protected. And here, Carlsen made a terrible blunder, but he is quite lost anyway. You can see that this knight is under fire from the rook. One possibility is to move the knight back, but then simply rook takes a3 is very unpleasant. Wins a pawn, keeps the attack going. It's horrible. Obviously, this can't be taken because white wins the queen. Carlsen in the game played queen c3. That's just an outright blunder. And he resigned. Just rook takes knight. Wins a piece. And that's the end of that. But in any case, as I said, I think white is completely lost in this position. If knight c3 isn't played, then, for example, there's knight e3 hitting the queen, which will have to move, and then rook takes knight. It has to move away from the protection of the knight So Carlsen really is completely lost in this position. I thought it's a really interesting game because it shows that in Fischer Random, in these unfamiliar opening positions, you can make a couple of decisions very early on in the game that actually leave you with quite a poor position. And I think Carlsen's position was already quite poor even here. Even before he took on c6, he recognised something had gone wrong, and I think it's already looking a little bit dubious. And after he took here, well, we're only on the 6th move, but basically, Wesley played very well indeed, but Carlsen has already saddled himself with a poor position. There you go. But Wesley, the world champion in Fischer Random, beating the classical and rapid world champion in that game. It's looking really tight in the tournament. After 6 rounds, Levon Aronian burst through, and he's on 4.5 out of 6. And then we have 3 players tied on 4 points. Nakamura, So, and Carlsen. Carlsen bounced back after this defeat. So it is looking very tight indeed. Garry Kasparov has 2 out of 6. So he's not doing too badly, but he had a very disappointing day yesterday. Anyway, we'll see what happens in the final 3 rounds. It's very close indeed.